Welcome to the Grove Podcast, where we feature Evergreen members and their real-life stories of salvation, transformation, struggle, and hope. I'm Joy Gabbert, and this is my husband, Andrew. Say hello.
Hello.
And today we have Jeremy and Heidi Warren.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Okay, so why don't you guys tell us a little bit about who you are, how many children you guys have, how long have you been at Evergreen, and where do you serve?
Yeah, my wife and I have 6 boys, ranging from 17 to newborn.
There you go.
And my wife and I have been at Evergreen for just under 4 years. This summer will be 4 years for us. Yep. We absolutely love it here. Mm-hmm. Why don't you tell them where you serve?
So I serve in the preschool ministry on Sunday mornings, and I teach 2 to 3-year-olds. I also serve in the Awana Cubbies, and I have 3 to 4-year-olds on Wednesday nights, and then on the summers for VBS.
Yeah, I serve in men's ministry with Dads on Special Assignment, which serves a lot of our families here, and we'll get into more of that later. Mm-hmm. But also serve on the security team as well.
Yeah, awesome. We just like to kind of hop right in. There's not much introductory there, so let's hop into your guys' stories. Jeremy, why don't you start off and tell us about your background a little bit?
I was raised in Broken Arrow, downtown Broken Arrow, and went to Broken Arrow High School. Loved sitting in the back of class and drawing. I was that kid that didn't pay much attention in class, but I loved to draw. I knew what I wanted to do and enjoyed that, and so graduated from Broken Arrow High School in 1999. Did 2 years of technical school with VOTEC my junior and senior year, and actually got a degree in advertising design and graphic arts.
Remind me, so you grew up in church, right?
I did, yes. I actually grew up at Aspen Park Baptist Church, that's just a couple miles from here. Mm-hmm. Pastor David Crump was the pastor there. That was my childhood church. I have a lot of incredible memories there with my youth pastors and some close friends, and some that actually are part of Evergreen now.
Yeah, very cool.
Can you go into a little bit some of the more significant spiritual influences in your life as a kid? What did that look like?
I mentioned briefly my youth pastors there. There's 2 individuals, Randy Alley and Jeff Johnson, who both served as youth pastors there, who were both very, very influential. I'd also say one of the greatest influences in my life was my grandpa. Mm. I grew up across the street from my grandparents. I didn't realize how unique that was to have them close, but he was definitely a spiritual leader to our family. He taught me what it looked like to pray together, to bring family together, to really lead well, and to enjoy one another. And so he was one of my greatest influences.
Heidi, what's your background?
I grew up going to a Catholic church and a Catholic school, which mm-hmm. was very different when I moved here. We still integrated into a Catholic church, but not a Catholic school. And that's when I started attending Awana with mm-hmm. one of my friends from school, and accepted Christ through that program. And
now,
so
you went to Awana for like the older kids, right?
Yeah, so middle school. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's
Yep.
cool. 'Cause I grew up doing Awana, but I didn't know that it went higher.
Yeah, it goes all the way through high school.
Yeah, that's really cool. So you were a middle schooler then in Awana. Mm-hmm. That's amazing.
Yep.
Yeah, keep going.
Yep. So also graduated same year as Jeremy in 1999. I went to a little bit of college afterwards, ORU, and went to First Baptist Church, and that's when I met Jeremy.
Can you go briefly into what the family dynamic was like when you became a believer? Growing up in a Catholic home, the way you described it, I grew up in a Catholic home, but I wasn't saved until middle school in Awana, which
Right.
is not a Catholic program.
Right.
So how did that affect the family dynamic?
I don't think I brought too much attention to it within my family because I just knew it wasn't the way it was supposed to be. My mom was cradle Catholic. That's where her background was, how she grew up, and that's just how our family was. So I don't think I really noticed much of the differences until later in high school and mostly in college that it was a significant separation. So,
well, tell me about when you guys met.
Oh, yeah, that's a fun story. I always enjoy telling that. We actually met at a New Year's Eve party.
Yeah.
But it's not the exciting New Year's Eve party that a lot of people would think. I did transition after being at Aspen Park Baptist for a number of years. After high school time frame, we went to First Baptist Broken Arrow. And we had a New Year's Eve party. And Heidi actually was invited there by her roommate at the time, who also attended First Baptist, and invited her to come, and met her that night for the first time. We dated for right at a year. We met that January. We dated until that following January, got engaged, and then married in August of 2003.
And then you guys decide a few years later to start having a family.
Yeah, so our first son was born in 2007, so almost 5 years in.
I loved being a dad. It was exciting, but it was very overwhelming. I remember going in after Logan was born and just standing over his crib and just watching him breathe and thinking, wow, like this is incredible, right? Like this is truly a gift from the Lord.
And that's your first.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so then your second, it's pregnancy, everything is all normal, just as kind of like the first. You kind of know what to expect.
I mean, for our knowledge, there was not anything different than our first child until he came out, purple, blue, not in the umbilical cord, and not breathing.
That was an intense few moments, with my oldest son. One of the challenges was cutting the umbilical cord. I always felt like that was a really manly opportunity to cut the, and so
Dad's first moment. Right
and I didn't realize how squishy it was, and so it took more than one cut.
Yeah,
and so
for
I was
those of you who don't have kids yet, you now know what to look forward to.
I was determined when Landon came out, like, hey, I'm going to cut this thing in one snip.
Yeah.
And as soon as he came out, he was completely purple, and the doctor and me was like, whoa. They needed to take some time to evaluate what was going on, because during the delivery, the knot had cinched up and actually cut off flow.
Okay.
And so it was a whirlwind after that. Heidi and I always had a commitment that I would stay with our son. And so, immediately they rush him and I out, and we're running down hallways, and they're trying to resuscitate him. And I honestly can't remember much from those few hours, but I remember it being a couple hours in and just looking up at one of the nurses and saying, can one of you please go tell my wife and my family that he's still alive?
Yeah, so I was left in the room not knowing for quite a while. Then once we knew he was okay, he was in the NICU, and it was like, we're just going to work on breathing and figure out what happened. And when they're back in the NICU, you can't just go back there. It's all structured and time sensitive and this and that, and only when all the rules you got to follow. But it was the middle of the night. I don't even remember. He might have been like 8 or 9 hours old. And they called us and said, oh, he's not doing well. His lungs collapsed. We need you to come down and sign a paper. I'm like, what in the heck? So we literally, a few hours after having a kid, you're in a completely separate room from them, and they wheel us down there. We have to sign papers before we can even go back and see him. And then they wouldn't let us see him because he needed more resuscitation, and they ended up putting in chest tubes because his lungs had collapsed. So they had put him on CPAP to try and just get him to breathe, but then realizing more intervention needed. So that's when they put him on a ventilator, and the chest tubes were just draining out fluid. So that was, it's tough, I think, because you have a kid and you keep them with you in the hospital room, right? And this is not the same situation. So then basically they might give you 5, 10, 20 minutes, and then you have to leave and go back down to your room or somewhere else. So honestly, for the first 2 weeks of life, that was him. You can barely move them to change the diaper. You don't pick up your child.
During those, especially those first several hours, but then the following 2 weeks, what were your conversations with God like?
I remember sitting in the ICU room and just looking out the window at 61st and Yale traffic and just watching all the traffic buzz by, and it was like life was in slow motion, and just asking, why God? Why me? Why us? Why our son?
I know I was off work for a while just because of maternity leave, but he was not. So I think just coordinating schedules just to then go see your child. And honestly, that's the worst thing, is being wheeled out of the hospital without your child in your hands.
Yeah. How long were you in the hospital?
So thankfully, I didn't need to be in the hospital, but my doctor was nice and like, oh, we need to keep you another day. Mm-hmm. But even still, I was only there for like 2 or 3 days. Like, you're not there for weeks on end. Mm. And he actually spent 6.5 weeks in the NICU. So, I mean, that's several weeks of you figuring out childcare, because you can't take a 2-year-old into a NICU. They wouldn't allow it.
And you just look at your son through a plexiglass box.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, he's still lifeless at this point. There's no movement.
Yeah.
You just have like beeping and like, so you know he's alive
Yeah.
still. Yeah.
Yeah. You're in a room with like 8 other babies beeping around you also. Like, it's just an overwhelming sensory thing of like all this commotion. And so that's why we were limited to like a 30-minute slot or an hour slot. And then
Were you guys given any like initial diagnosis?
no, so they thought really there could just be some brain damage from birth, or let's run some genetic testing. And so I think at like 2 or 3 weeks old, we started running genetic testing. And we had requested like a vision specialist, because I could just tell like he wasn't tracking me. He wasn't looking. And the neurology came in, like they ran different blood work and this and that. And they were like, no, I mean, he's just kind of like a NICU baby who needs some caffeine and needs to work on suck, swallow, breathing. But he was a 39-weeker. That's not a NICU baby, you know, not the typical kid who's touching both ends of the isolette, because he was fairly decent sized, you know. So we took him home. We took him home on some oxygen, some O2 monitor, and like, make sure your kid stays within this range. Okay. Well, he wasn't staying within that range. And I was like, I don't really know what to do. We're trying to feed and all this stuff. Well, he had lost some weight. So when we went, you know, back to have him checked, yeah, he's lost some weight. I'm like, I can't get him to eat. Like, he's so tired and sleepy. Well, that's because he can't suck, swallow, breathe all at the same time. It was just too much work for him. He could not brain function, multitask, all the things. And so they were like, well, we probably need to put in a feeding tube. So we went and they put in a feeding tube, and they have to sedate them. So then when he came out, he was in the PICU and wasn't waking up out of anesthesia well. And they were like, oh, well, sometimes that happens. And anyways, this one nurse came in and was like, wow, does he always do that? I'm like, yeah, that's just Landon. That's just what he does. And they were like, nope, that's not normal. We're going to have to trach him. I'm like what? So they then talked to us about putting a tracheostomy in him to put him on a ventilator full time. That's the only way you're leaving the hospital. So I think within 24 hours of that surgery, they went back in and did the surgery to put in the tracheostomy. And we learned a whole new way of taking care of a child.
Yeah.
Looking back on it, is there anything that you wish your friends would have asked about, or wished for a way that they might have stepped in to help out? Is there anything that they could have done?
You know, I'm reminded of the story of Job. Whenever Job was in great distress, it says that his friends came and they sat in silence. I think just the idea of having strong men who would just surround you, even if it was for no other reason than to sit in silence.
I agree with you. I mean, I've been through some seasons where having somebody just come and sit and be quiet, it really does mean the world. So you don't need to know what to say. Yeah.
100%.
Yeah, that's good. So for the first year, he was kind of in the same condition.
It extended well past that.
But I mean, for sure, like even at 9 months old, could barely hold up his head like a floppy doll.
Yeah.
Newborn by 9 months old. Anyway, so it was about 2 years, and we were looking at getting a getting in and off the wait list at the Tulsa Little Lighthouse, a school for special needs kids. And he couldn't go with a tracheostomy unless I was there with him. Well, I also worked part-time and I had a child. Like, there's no way that I could just stay there. And it was one of those things where we were pushing our kid anyways. And so I wanted to have the tracheostomy removed. And so we worked hard to get him off the ventilator. And our pulmonologist, even here in Tulsa, didn't like it. So we found a pulmonologist in Oklahoma City who would work with us. And he said, okay, if you work on these weaning settings on the ventilator, then I'll consider taking out the trach. And so we did, and he did okay. So anyways, we had the stoma closed up right before, within weeks of going into the Tulsa Little Lighthouse, which, man, anyone who has a special needs kid, put them on the wait list. That is like the own little bubble that you can't replace anywhere else. It's amazing. And so he was actually at the Tulsa Little Lighthouse for 3 years.
3 years.
Yeah.
During this time, you guys are new to having a child with special needs and maybe not having a community that came around you as much as you would have liked. What kind of toll or did it take on your marriage? Did it make you closer? Did it make things more difficult?
You know, I'm just reminded of a verse in Mark 10, verses 6-9. It says, "But from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. For this reason, a man shall leave his mother and father, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let no man separate." And I just remember for Heidi and I, we took our marriage seriously. We knew that we had to prioritize one another. I failed miserably as a husband for the first, I won't even name the number of years. I think I failed miserably as a dad. But we had never, ever even contemplated the idea of allowing even something as traumatic as this to separate or pull us apart. We were in this together.
Yeah. Well, and I think when you go through a tragedy, I mean, at any level, like, God's the only way to rely on, and then the next is your spouse. Like, that's all we had.
Yeah.
So I don't think that it was it's like a non-negotiable thing, marriage, but then even more so when you're going through something like this, because the other partner is the only one that understands the full level of what you're dealing with.
Yeah.
She was the only other person who understood my thoughts, because she was facing the same trauma. And I think ultimately it's bonded us together stronger than ever before. And she was faithful to me because I allowed myself to get distracted and isolated for a number of years because I was trying to process it all.
At what point did you realize that Landon may not grow out of this?
Even when we left the NICU or the PICU, it was like, you know, he's not doing well today. He may not be here tomorrow. Like, we never really knew an outcome because we didn't have a diagnosis.
Yeah.
So our diagnosis of the Landon Warren syndrome only takes you so far. So yeah, like, there was times when he was on the trach at home and he had some, you know, bad illnesses that typical kids don't get. And you don't know that outcome because we don't have this semi-guidebook of like, okay, our kid has a diagnosis, he's going to fall in this spectrum. We don't have that spectrum. We don't have that diagnosis to even give us an outcome.
I think it was day by day.
Yeah.
You know, just I remember being in the ICU room and having a doctor walk in, and I was there before work one day, and I remember him looking at me and saying, "Hey, I'll give you a few extra minutes with your son because he may not be here when you get off work today."
Now, your older son, I mean, he was still really little when Landon was born.
Yeah, he was 2 years, 2 months when Landon was born.
How was that for him, though? Like, did he struggle like not having mom and dad as often, or
So
having
he
a brother?
was in a mom's day out, and beyond that, he was with us, maybe on occasion with grandparents or a friend's house so that we could go see him.
I think for Logan at the time, he didn't know anything different.
Yeah, just
I mean,
is
that
what
was
it
his
is.
only experience. It wasn't until we had our third son, Lane, that there were some things that really started to develop in understanding just some of what he had
What the severity of your
experienced
brother's life actually was.
as a young
Yeah.
boy himself.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So tell us about
Just a
that,
little.
having your third.
Yeah, man, that was a really big, I think, trust God for everything.
Yeah.
Heidi and I knew that we wanted more kids. We just felt like that's what the Lord desired for us. We felt that desire in our hearts, and we committed to that. And yeah, whenever we shared with family and friends that we were pregnant again, it was met with pretty interesting response. I think in a lot of people's minds, we had 2 kids. We had one that had extensive medical needs and required a lot of attention, and so that was a good place to stop.
Yeah.
And so whenever we shared that we were having another one, it was interesting. And then as you know, once Lane was born and started to grow up, you know, he was doing all the typical things that little kids do, and so that's when Logan really started recognizing, you know, hey, this kid's different than my other brother. You know, I remember one time sitting at the dinner table, and you know, Landon's at this point had always been on a ventilator and didn't make any sounds other than the beeping on the machine. And whenever Lane started making noise, Logan just looked across the dinner table at Heidi and I, go, "Can you turn him off?"
I can't just turn off the crying.
Why is he talking?
Or whatever, yeah.
Like he didn't understand.
Not the
Like,
same.
this little kid's making noise. What is the deal?
That's precious.
And so then recognizing, like, hey, there's some real things here that.
Yeah.
Yeah, because your third kid starts crawling, walking, talking, all before, you know, your second kid who's barely in a stander or a walking device contraption strapped in and really can't do that much.
Now, you mentioned how, you know, telling people that you were pregnant again, it was kind of met with interesting responses. At this time, I think it was this time, you guys also started to foster, didn't you?
Yeah.
We did. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So how was that?
Apparently our life was not
response?
crazy enough.
We had the opportunity to take in a sibling set.
Yeah.
A little boy with cerebral palsy, was just a few months different from Landon, required the same therapy and a lot of the same things. And so, man, Heidi and I just felt called to that. We knew we wanted to foster. We knew we wanted a big family. And this case presented itself, and we were like, hey, we already know how to do this. Let's do it.
Wow. Man, I can't imagine though, like the stress, you know, of having a lot of children that are depending on you, and still learning how to maybe cope with the new normal. Yeah.
You know, Joy, but that's the Christian life.
Yeah.
There's a lot of children dependent on Him.
Yeah.
You know, we are God's sons and daughters,
Yeah.
and we're dependent on Him. And I think it's a reflection for me in seeing these kids that we're fostering and seeing our own biological kids, and knowing that, yeah, they're dependent on me,
Yeah.
and I have to be dependent on my Father, or else they have no chance.
I just really admire you guys for opening your hearts and opening up your home in the middle of your own crisis, you know. I just really think that was neat. In those years, I want to know kind of how you ended up eventually coming to Evergreen.
So we had been at a church for a really long time, and then we went and actually helped church plant out in a small little community, and then came back to Tulsa, and then went to another smaller church, like just kind of moved around the last maybe 8 years or so. And we had moved, from Broken Arrow to Inola to Tulsa.
There's a lot of things that were happening too simultaneously that was connecting us to Evergreen.
Okay.
Just between Heidi, Heidi directing for a homeschool co-op and asking her to take over the group that was meeting here. The church we were at currently, they were directly connected with the pastors here at Evergreen, and so the youth was doing a special event that year.
Camp Encounter.
Camp Encounter. And so
Evergreen hosted that.
Yeah, Evergreen. And so Logan was getting to participate in that, which was a big deal because we had a very small youth group where we were at. And
not every
Logan
church did camps that summer.
Yeah, a lot of camps were canceled, which is why they put together Camp Encounter. And so, and there's a couple other things. And so there's just a lot of different areas that was pulling us to
knowing
Evergreen.
that they had Awanas.
Awanas was a big one, as you guys already heard from Heidi's childhood. Awanas was a very important part.
Yeah, it's something that I wanted my kids in, and we hadn't had that before just because our previous churches didn't host that. So knowing that our oldest middle school, high school kid would be able to be connected with friends that he already knew at Evergreen. Our littles would be able to be connected with homeschool people, and just knowing how much connection with Evergreen. And then Awanas here.
Heidi and I had actually watched a couple of Gabbert's messages online, and then we decided to come visit that Sunday that things had kind of cranked back up. And I remember him specifically from the pulpit in tears sharing that we will never shut the doors again. This won't happen again. And really set the foundation for me of, okay, here's a church and here's a pastor who believes the way that I believe and is willing to move in a way that I agree with, and be willing to stand firm and go to battle and be a warrior for Christ and do whatever's necessary. And I remember Heidi and I just knowing instantaneously, man, this is our home. This is where we belong. And just seeing from that very first Sunday of how this church embraced our family.
Yeah.
And just seeing that connection.
For those that are listening, Evergreen, we have children's Sunday school for children with special needs, and we have a whole team. But I think when y'all came, that was like the beginnings of it, wasn't it?
So Landon was the second. There was one other kid here before him, and so Jen said we have a buddy for him, which you just don't even think about that. But she was like, no, we have buddies. And so basically, and now Evergreen's program has grown tremendously.
Yeah.
They want to integrate the kids into the typical classroom setting and the children's worship and whatever they can participate in. And if they can't, okay, fine, we'll go to our own room. And so she said, we'll have someone with him the whole time. And what does he need? What would make him need to leave the room? When do you want us to call you? All the questions where we're just wow, okay. And they don't look at it as a babysitter. They literally pair them up, and it's their friend. Yeah. So do you want to go to Sunday school class today or not? Do you want to go to the youth room or not, depending on your kid's age level? Yeah.
Okay, so let's back up just a little bit, because I think this will be pertinent to the future in your story. Tell us a little bit, Jeremy, about some of your employment opportunities. You were in some nonprofits and things before, right?
I was, yeah. So part of my story was I love design, as I shared with you, and I went into graphic design and sign manufacturing out of high school. And it was in my early 20s that I just really felt like God was leading me into ministry. And I remember going and actually inviting my pastor to lunch, and we sat down and had lunch, and I was just sharing my heart with him. And I remember him saying to me, Jeremy, I've met a lot of guys with this zeal and this passion for the Lord that you share, and often at times associate that with a call to ministry, but very few people are called to ministry, and most likely you're not. And that really stuck with me. And so then I continued in my professional career, built a business over the course of the next 10 years. fast forward to 2017, I lost everything. I had a failed partnership. Some things happened, and I ended up with none of it. And right after that, I got introduced to the Journey. I was in a group here locally with a group of businessmen, and I got to know a guy intimately, and he said, "Hey, I'm leading a Journey group this year. I'd love for you to come be a part of this." And so I started that process. The year leading up to that, I had started writing a book that I felt like God had really impressed on my heart, and was writing, and he gave me this book, Journey to the Inner Chamber, and asked me to read it. And I didn't want any influence in my life at that point. I was very honed in on what I was writing, and I didn't want influences from outside sources. And so several months went by, and he came back to me and he said, "Hey, did you ever read that book?" And I go, "No." He goes, "I really need you to read it. We're going to start our group, here soon." And I remember picking up Journey to the Inner Chamber and reading that book, and there was some very, very strong similarities in what Rocky had written and what I had written. And so it captured my attention. And so I started that group and got about halfway through it, and had a call from Frank, a dear friend of mine. And we went and sat down for breakfast, and he asked me a question that completely rocked my world. He said, "Have you ever considered ministry?" And so I shared my story with him from all those years ago. And he said, "Jeremy, I would love for you to prayerfully consider coming on staff with influencers and being the area director to lead pastors and men in discipleship." And so I accepted that position and went on staff and got to do that for 2 years.
Can you just briefly, so I'm finishing up my first time through the Journey right now. By the time this episode comes out, we'll have completed the Journey. Can you explain just real quickly for men who don't know of the Journey, what is it?
The Journey is really a 9-month discipleship process. It's not a program, but it is really to get to the heart of men and help them understand what it truly means to abide in Christ, and help to understand the importance of seeking God, abiding with Him, and living out that which we learn and know to be true.
You were with influencers, I think, when we met you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then I remember, because we were in the same Sunday school class for a while, when you asked for prayer for something that you wanted to start called DOSA.
Yeah, just touching back to the time that Landon was at Little Lighthouse, me and another dad named Adam had just really connected, and him and I were having the conversation because at the time there was nothing for men. There are so many incredible organizations that serve kids with special needs. There's even a lot of incredible organizations that serve women, because the reality is women are usually the primary caregiver. And I remember him and I just having the conversation like, man, we should put something together for men. But through a series of reasons, that never came to fruition. And when we came to Evergreen, I got connected with some of the other families that were here. And one of the things that Evergreen talks about so specifically is, hey, if you're here, if you're a member, there's a place for you in the body. And I remember driving over to Arkansas and sitting down with Brian Craig and with Rocky Fleming, Rocky being the one who founded Influencers, and just sharing my heart with him, and him just embracing me and saying, Jeremy, your story is so much like my story, and this is not the best place for you. God has something else for you. And just processing through that. And I remember coming to Evergreen and saying, hey, there's several families here that I would like to connect with and put together a men's group for us to meet. And I remember asking several people to pray for that. There was a Friday morning in particular that I asked a couple friends. We were together and they said, hey, let's pray about it right now. And I'll never forget my friend Jim prayed one of those prayers that we finish up and it's like, oh, Jim, that was really nice, but you don't really take it to heart. And Jim had said, man, Lord, if there is something specific today that you can do to show Jeremy that he is moving in the direction that you desire for him, would you do that? And it was 30 minutes later, my phone rang. And it was somebody that I hadn't talked to on the phone in years. It was Adam. It was the dad from Little Lighthouse. And so I shared with him really what God had put on my heart. And he was in another state at the time. And he's like, I'm on my way. And we had our very first DOSA meeting in the coffee shop up front. On a Saturday morning at 8 o'clock. 8 men. And I just shared a story with them. Shared a story about Landon and I just laid out the vision of what I thought God was doing. And I remember just, man, I have walked hundreds of laps around this track just praying about, man, God, what are you doing? And then going to influencers and stepping down from my position at the end of 2021 and formed a board, contacted some men that I trusted, that I knew, and said, man, I feel like God is leading me to start a men's ministry for dads that have sons and daughters with a mental, physical, or medical challenge, often defined as special needs. And that's when DOSA was born.
Yep, I remember going to your first year gala and doing some, auctioning there to raise some money. Tell us what that first year was like. How much growth did you have? What are some of that you're allowed to share? What are some of the stories that came out of that from the dads that started coming?
Yeah, it's been incredible to watch. As the men started attending here, several of them came to me and said, hey, I've got another dad that I know from Little Lighthouse, or hey, I've got this guy I met at therapy, or can I invite them? And then I came back to Evergreen and said, hey, this is much greater than just what we're doing here. And so we expanded that and started inviting other guys. And then it was just a few months later that a lady on staff at Battle Creek Church reached out. They have an incredible Haven ministry there that serves special needs, and said, hey, we would love to use DOSA as a resource for our families. And I remember going and meeting with them and just sharing the vision and mission with them, and them coming on as a partner church and launching a second location for these monthly support groups for dads. And then shortly after that, getting contacted by a guy who volunteers at Little Lighthouse, and sending me a message saying, hey, I've had multiple moms now ask me, do you know anything about this Dads on Special Assignment or DOSA group? And him coming and participating in one of our groups, and him just sharing that with Little Lighthouse, and then them reaching out and us having support groups that meet there, which is really where it started for me mentally. And then having the opportunity to expand it to a Friends Church in Midtown Tulsa. Mm-hmm. And so seeing now having, multiple groups, and then, writing curriculum, and having some additional things to offer, and seeing, for me, this is the important thing to recognize, is that it's not about numbers, it's not about locations, but it is about the depth of the life of a man.
Heidi, what have you seen in your husband through this?
So I feel like it's been good because he is helping other men. I know that there's reward. I know that there's also a lot of stress and struggles that come with it. And you might get a phone call at XYZ time and you might have to leave the party, but that's, where he feels called. And I feel like, man, when someone's doing what they're supposed to be doing, it's good and it shows. And he's dedicated. I feel like probably even just since going through the journey and through DOSA, like more even understands what he should be doing as the leader, as the, dad in the house, and those things too, for sure.
If there's somebody listening to this podcast today, maybe they're an Evergreen member, or just somebody who is listening and they're across the country, and they just found out that their child has a diagnosis, and maybe they do have a special needs child already, and they've been battling that dynamic in their family for a while, and feeling alone and not really having a community. What is something that you would want to say to them to encourage them?
I think what I would want to say to them is that they're not alone, that God sees them, and that their son or daughter is not a mistake. There is a God who sees you, who knows, who cares, who's willing, who's able. And I ask if they see them. It's not just a part of you, but it's all of you. Being a dad on special assignment is not something that can be done alone. We all have an assignment. And for those dads on special assignment, this ministry exists. Know that I love you. And if you want to learn more about this ministry or how to become a partner, you can visit us at dosausa.org.
Thank you for tuning in and listening to today's episode. If you have any questions or want to hear about our church, please visit our website at evergreenbc.org. That is evergreenbc.org.